Welcome back to the Halo Away podcast. Today I am joined by Leanne Elliott, occupational psychologist, consultant and coach, and also the co-host of the award-winning Truth, Lies and Work podcast, all about company culture. In this episode, we talk about the history behind workplace culture, common misconceptions, and whether company culture is just a buzzword. So thank you so much for joining me today, Leanne.
Thank you for having me.
Just for context for other people, I found you through your podcast, which is really exciting. So I was wondering if you mind doing a little introduction about what you do and then maybe a little bit about your podcast as well.
Yeah, my name is Leanne Elliott. I'm a chartered occupational psychologist and consultant. And for the last 15 years or so, my job is basically boiled down to helping business owners, business leaders create awesome workplace cultures. As you mentioned, we also have a podcast. I'm a co-host of Truth, Lies and Work, which is the love of our life, I think. We're very lucky. It's an award-winning psychology podcast and one of the fastest growing shows on the HubSpot podcast network. So yeah, podcasting, always loved it as a medium. I think I started listening to podcasts probably about 10 years ago, which really ages me. Early adopter. And actually, it's our second show. Al, my co-host and husband, we actually started our first podcast in 2018 about traveling and living abroad. So we always knew we were going to create another show, but we just didn't know. We just didn't know what. And then Truth, Lies and Work, if I'm being honest, it was created through frustration.
Right. As most things are, actually.
Yeah, I think they are, aren't they? It's I love that people are talking more about workplace culture, about working life. When I first, went into this industry 15 years ago, those conversations weren't being had. So I'm delighted that people are talking about these things. But if I'm being honest, there's an awful lot of rubbish out there as well. I'm sure that you've seen, probably this week even at some point, you've seen somebody on social media talking about how to create a great workplace culture. And they're really convincing, right? They'll use all the right terminology. They'll say things like psychological safety or belonging or well-being. Well-being is everywhere at the moment.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And the thing is about it is that they're talking about the outcomes of a great culture. They're talking about what happens if we invest in building a great culture. We have psychological safety. We feel a sense of belonging. We experience positive well-being. But the real experts, the psychologists, the scientists, they talk about human behavior because they know that human behavior is what drives a culture and that drives the outcomes. So that's kind of why we started the show, really. So it's not about throwing around buzzwords, quoting the latest bit of research, usually from Gallup, seems to be very popular. It's really about the science. It's the science of human psychology, human behavior in the workplace. And the more that we can understand that and help business leaders and owners understand that, then that's when we're really going to start to drive the systemic change that's needed to actually create awesome workplaces. Very long answer.
No, not at all. That's really interesting. And I think one thing that I haven't obviously this has been a podcast sort of slightly about us, but also discovering more about workplace culture and how different people do it. One word I have not heard so far is science, which is so interesting. The way that you explain it, it's, yeah. Well, I think some of the things are, it is looking at the solutions and how you actually implement it. And there is research based on it, but the physical word itself in science hasn't actually been used, which is very interesting.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding with when I work with organizations. They'll often be like, you're a psychologist, you're coming with all the answers and the solutions, welcome. And it's like, I'm not coming with any solutions, not at this point. I'm just coming with lots and lots of questions because every organization is different. Every group of employees, every team is different. You'll know if you just worked in more than one organization, the different experiences and feelings you have. So it really is about gathering the data. It's gathering the information. It's understanding what's happening in the business, how that's impacting how people are thinking, feeling, and behaving within the business. And once you understand that, then designing the intervention. And that's why I have beef with off-the-shelf employee engagement surveys and well-being interventions and mindfulness at lunch, because they're being diminished and diluted in their worth because they're not being applied correctly, or they're not solving the problem that is in hand. There needs to be a diagnostic. You need to first understand the problem. It's like anything. It's like if you go to a doctor and just prescribes antibiotics. We now know that that's really bad because it now breeds even more, really super strong viruses that antibiotics are resistant to. And it's a similar thing. Employees become resistant to wellbeing interventions because they're living and working in a toxic culture. They're living with a virus.
Yeah. Do you think that sort of causes more exhaustion when people try and implement the well-being stuff that isn't actually appropriate to that case, and then you have these employees who feel exhausted by it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think social media have coined it wellness washing. It's the eye rolls, it's the frustration, it's the not engaging with it. I'm sure at this point in the UK, 9 out of 10 organizations probably have some kind of EAP program that includes some kind of counseling program. And I'm sure the engagement rates are really, really low, because going to a session on how to be resilient, how to be more mindful, is not going to help me if I have a manager who treats me like crap, talks to me with disrespect, gives me too much work to do, and I'm not paid fairly. And yet I'm going to fix that by going to a resilience session. So yeah, it breeds all this mistrust. And what's frustrating is then as you see things reported in the news, I'm sure you saw it, that a few months ago, wellbeing interventions prove not to work by science. And it's basically, the Oxford research study. But what they didn't report on is the context.
Yeah.
They didn't report on whether that intervention that was being implemented had been implemented appropriately to solve a specific problem that had been identified. So really what it's reporting on is that these solutions are ineffective if we don't take the time to first understand the problem. And that's the problem. And that's the biggest lie about workplace culture.
That's the lies and the truth lies.
That's a lie in it all, that it's somehow turned into this tick box exercise. And it's not, it's science.
Do you think there's something in that where, because I was reading this book called Sedated, and hopefully I get this right, but I think it was a while back, and I think it was talking about how a lot of people have mental health issues that are medicated. And actually, a lot of the root causes are the systems, and a lot of it is specifically to do with work, but obviously economic systems that people are tied up in that are actually broken. And the solution is to medicate these individuals in order to help them solve the problem. But obviously, it's a systemic issue. And I guess it's kind of like similar in that capacity, where it's like trying to put the onus on your employees and trying to fix them individually as like a tick box exercise. You're like, look, we're doing these things. It's not really our fault if it's not actually working.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I can't comment much on the use of medication in pathological conditions. But
absolutely,
what I will comment on is exactly that, as you said, that analogy. That one of my favorite ways it was explained to me was by a guest we had on the show called Sally Clark, and she's a burnout researcher. And she said it's kind of like if you have a lake and it's got 1,000 fish in it. If one fish dies, you're going to ask what's wrong with the fish. If all the fish die, you're going to ask what's wrong with the lake. What's wrong with the water? And I think that's the easiest thing to kind of to explain it is, there are, of course, individual level interventions that can support happiness and well-being and health. Of course there are. But it doesn't matter if you're doing all of those things, if you're spending, most of your life in a toxic working environment. And that's why we get burnout. So there needs to be a balance, and there needs to be some, I guess it needs to be joined up. It needs to be part of a full strategy, an overarching strategy that work together. But yeah, there's a lot of emphasis on the individual, and I don't think there's enough emphasis on the organization or enough accountability being taken by organizations.
Yeah, that's so true. One thing I'd love to go back to burnout maybe later, but one thing I'd really love to talk about is obviously you've been working in this space for quite some time. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what it was like when you started compared to what is happening now? Because I think a lot of people are talking about workplace culture. But I'm just wondering if that was the case before. Was that an emphasis of people?
No, no, it really wasn't. I was attracted to occupational psychology, business psychology, organizational psychology, whatever you want to call it. It's all the same thing. I was attracted to it because I was like, oh, cool. We can use the science of human behavior to create environments for the majority, and we all thrive and live these wonderful, fulfilling lives, which, as a 22-year-old, when you're just graduating, that's the kind of world I want to live in. But yeah, I joined the big bad world. I graduated in 2008, the start of the big recession. Perfect timing. Nobody cared about culture. Nobody cared about well-being. It wasn't part of the conversation. So, people like me would end up working for the Department of Work and Pensions, or the NHS perhaps, or at best, maybe a boutique consultancy or IBM, because again, they're probably ticking a box somewhere. So nobody really understood what it was. And what's been really wonderful as time has gone on, but equally a sad symptom of the times, is the disruption we've had in the world of work over the last 15 years has been massive. And particularly for millennials and then the Gen Zs that are now joining the workforce. I said I'm an older millennial. I graduated in 2008. I've seen, the Great Recession. I've seen Brexit. I've seen the pandemic. And that's just in the space of about 11 years. And I think because of that, it's really two things have happened. It's reframed work entirely for two generations, and that's the millennials, and the Gen X. And I think the Gen Z I think maybe they came with this view. We're still figuring out, what their sentiment is. But certainly for the Gen X and the millennials who are in the world of work, it completely shifted what work was. Because our parents grew up in a world where they would get a job and it would be with the same organization for life, and they'd get developed and they'd progress and they'd have a really safe, generous pension, and they'd retire with 2 kids and a gold watch at 65. That doesn't exist anymore. People are made redundant. People lose their jobs. People see their industries go under, or their jobs don't even exist with the technology advancements that are going on. And then the pandemic happened, the little cherry on the cake, that meant that if we're doing this, if we're putting ourselves through this effort, through this, all this hardship at times of working the number of hours we do, of having it such a big chunk of our life, then it's got to be worth it. And if it can't be worth it in terms of security, and it can't be worth it in terms of financial gain, then it needs to be meaningful, and it needs to be purpose-led, and it needs to align with my values, so I feel some sense of fulfillment from getting out of bed and going to work every morning. And with that, combined with that, social media. So when I was in my early 20s in my career, and I hated my boss, he was awful. I would moan to my friends in the pub on a Friday night, or over a coffee, or at the gym, and be like, oh my God, he said this, you won't believe it. Those conversations now are happening on social media. We see it on Instagram, we see it on TikTok, we even start to see it on LinkedIn. And it's people calling out poor behaviors, poor management behaviors, poor working experiences. Quiet quitting isn't new, but it's the terminology that's being used on social media to describe a problem that has been around for decades. And that's getting attention. And, in the media, they say no publicity is bad publicity, but I know if you're getting called out for workplace bullying, it's not so good, is it? So I think that's the biggest thing that's kind of really driving the conversations and the biggest change, and why it's been talked about so much more. Work is now part of the conversation, our day-to-day conversation. I think 15 years ago, it wasn't really, not part of the day-to-day.
Yeah. And that's really interesting what you were saying about Gen Z, because we have an episode where we spoke all about Gen Z and how sort of they seem to be a lot more value-led, which is very interesting, and making that a priority, whereas I'm sure other generations would have liked that, but it wasn't perhaps their priority at that point. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I love that Gen Z are joining the workforce with this in mind. You see people get kind of their late 30s, early 40s and freak out and go, what am I doing with my life? And going through this massive career changes. And it's usually because their values are misaligned with their work, or their work is misaligned with the lifestyle that they want, or the family that they have. It doesn't enable that balance or even integration, whatever way you want to look at it. And that's what causes the stress and the burnout and the big career pivots, and why we're seeing, a huge number of the over 50s. I think, is it 1 million at the moment, over 50s in the UK of working age aren't in work. So it's wonderful that Gen Z are starting their career, starting their working life with this in mind. It's much more sustainable.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. We, for context, we're a company with a lot of Gen Z, sort of the majority. And I don't know about the others, but definitely one of my fears is sort of waking up when I'm older and thinking, where has this time gone? What have I been doing? Why am I doing this thing I just don't care about? Like, why have I spent the time doing that?
Yeah, and I think it's which question's going to get you. It's a question that you'll wake up early in your career and go, is this it? And try and find something better. Or you'll wake up 20 years into your career and go, was that it? It's one or the other. And it's, of course, we make light of it, and people have to make very, very careful decisions based on what they need to provide for themselves and their family.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't mean that finding work that is fulfilling, that is meaningful, can't also be part of the conversation.
Absolutely. So how do you think that is sort of changing the way that people think about company culture? Or just as a kind of a question I'm sure you'll disagree with, but do you think it is just a buzzword?
Oh, do you know what? I actually think the way culture is being used is a buzzword.
Oh, interesting.
I think it is, because I don't think it's not being used correctly. And that's the irony of our show. We don't even really use it correctly, not in the terms of psychology and the research. And that's because there's no agreed definition of culture in the research. There's more than 50. The definition I like is by John Amici, who says culture is determined by the worst behaviours tolerated, because it's that behavioural drive that I mentioned at the top of our conversation there.
I love that. That's so interesting.
Yeah, and do you know what I love about it is it means that everyone's accountable. You can't be like, oh, we've got a great culture, we just got a couple of bad apples. No.
Yeah.
Your culture is defined by the worst, the ugliest and the worst.
Nina's just sitting here with her mouth wide open.
Yeah. I have to reiterate, that's John Amici. I wish I'd come up with that. Brilliant. Excuse me. So I think in terms of how the word is being used currently, it is a buzzword, because often when people talk about culture, and you see this on social media as well, they're not really talking about culture. They're actually talking about, in terms of the science of it, they're talking about employee engagement, or they're talking about leadership, or they're talking about psychological safety, or it's a very catch-all term. And I'm okay with that, because anything that gives people the vocabulary in businesses and organizations to talk about this stuff and try and understand it more, I'm here for it. I'm not gonna pick apart, when you're talking about culture and actually you're talking about psychological safety. That's not the point. But I think in terms of how it's changed is what I was saying about the social media. There's organizations haven't dealt with this issue for decades. And if we look at the research in terms of well-being, in terms of employee engagement, in terms of the quality of managers, we've got 50, 60 years of research stacking up that positive behaviors in the workplace mean positive experiences for employees, which means high performance, high levels of well-being. It goes back further than that. It actually goes back to the Hawthorne studies, which happened in the 1920s. So this is a problem that organizations have known about for a long time. The difference now is that people are shouting about it on social media. It's part of the public conversation. It's part of everybody's day-to-day awareness. Everybody knows what happened at Twitter and how that was dealt with by Elon Musk. Everybody knows about the mass tech layoffs and who did it well and who did it badly. Everybody knows about all the things that happen in these organizations, these scandals. So organizations are at a point now where they're like, well, if we don't show what our culture is to the world, if we don't talk about it, then we're not going to attract the right talent we want into our business, because that's what people are expecting and wanting now. They want great places to work where their individuality is going to be prioritized, their well-being is going to be prioritized, they're going to engage in meaningful work. And they won't tolerate it if they don't get that. And the proof of that was a great resignation after the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's more a case of none of this is new. None of this is new. But because of social media, it's now in a realm, and podcasts and YouTube, it's now in a conversation that is really hard for organizations to ignore because the secrecy is gone. And in the secrecy was the power. And without the power, or that power shifting towards the employee, organizations need to start and try and be more accountable. And I think this is my frustration with there's a lot of box ticking. There's lots of, oh yeah, we have a wellbeing program. Oh yeah, we have this benefit. Oh yeah, we do that. And it's like, do you measure the impact of that? Do you know how it actually translates to employee outcomes, to organizational outcomes? And let's not pretend that this is all just like a kumbaya moment. This stuff is really good for business. If you have happy employees, you're more profitable. You make more money, you grow faster, you have happier customers, you're more innovative, you're more creative. It's also really good for business. So yeah, a rambling answer, I think, to basically that, is culture a buzzword? Yes. Am I here for it? Yes. But I'm also here for re-educating people in terms of the why behind some of these terms and the how we do those things, not just putting a ping pong table in the break room and hoping everything will be okay.
Well, do you think, so obviously people have known about this, and now because of social media, it's sort of being slightly uncovered or more spoken about. Do you see organizations actually making those changes and actually managing to create these positive impacts?
Largely no, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, largely no. And you know what? I love working with small organizations, owner-led organizations, and that's what I do and we do as part of our consultancy, because that's almost like the grassroots change. Because for each small organization that might grow into a big organization, if they get their fundamentals right early, then it's so much easier. And I see that in business owners. I see that more in entrepreneurs. There's curiosity, this thirst for knowledge, this wanting to understand how this works and what's best and why. Why does that work? So I can replicate it in the future if I want to. So yeah, smaller businesses, they're starting to understand it more. But even then, it's constrained to culture, engagement, at leadership at best. Very few people will include recruitment as part of their culture audit exercise. And let's be honest, if you don't get it right in recruitment and you're not bringing the right people into your business, then that's going to impact your culture. That's why culture starts with recruitment. Absolutely. But that's not really part of the conversation. So I think there's steps being made. Larger organizations, few. I actually had a conversation on LinkedIn today. It's public, so I'm sure they won't mind mentioning it, but it was with a senior wellbeing leader at EasyJet. And the conversation was, he quoted some research, groundbreaking research that's been available for 50 years about how manager behaviors directly impact employee engagement, performance, and wellbeing. And how, do we think this is right? The question was, do we think this is right? Do you think that we need to invest more in manager training? And it was kind of like, well, yeah, of course we do. Of course we do. And my point was, it's, as a psychologist, I've had to go through 7 years of training, both academic and on the job. I'm governed by at least 5 different codes of ethics, countless laws. Wow. If I mess up, there is a route people can take to make sure that I get punished, that I get struck off and my career is done. I won't work again as a psychologist. I will never have the same level of impact on an employee's well-being as their line manager. Yeah, I had to go through all of that scrutiny and all of that and quite rightly, because, what I do impacts the human experience. And that isn't the same for managers. So this was a conversation we were having, and I basically said this, and the senior leader from EasyJet said, yeah, but don't you think that's a lot of responsibility and accountability to put on a manager's shoulders? I'm like, yeah, but that's the gig. Yeah. That's what you signed up for as a manager. And then it turns to, but often managers blame and finger pointing. And I'm like, well, then you're talking about culture and you're talking about the worst behaviors tolerated. That's a different, different topic. And I just think with big organizations, there's this kind of lack of accountability and this lack of, it's all very wishy-washy. And it's like, no, being a leader, being a line manager is really, really, really hard. And it is a lot of responsibility. It is a lot of accountability, which is why they need to be trained. It's why they need to be supported. It's why they need to be coached. And I think that's it. That's my issue with bigger organizations. I don't think they're really taking the time to get down to it. And let's be honest, there are very few organizations out there, large organizations, that actually employ psychologists.
Yeah.
They don't. Their head of well-being was an ops director, or maybe in sales and marketing. It's shocking the amount of how few organizations actually have psychologists or even, human or behavioral scientists, neuroscientists in their C-suite, in their people and culture departments. They're not. They're marketing, their ops, their sales there. And that's frustrating. One of the few exceptions to that is Langer O'Rourke, a construction company in the UK, is doing phenomenal work around behaviour and well-being and innovation. And so no, I don't think people are doing enough. And you've caught me on a very specific day where one of these conversations is recent, so I'm getting on my soapbox about it. But no, we're not doing good enough. Look at the state of mental health. Look at the state of burnout. We're not doing good enough. We have to do better.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you kind of circled back to burnout, because I'd love to talk about this. I'm sure at this point everybody knows about burnout, but do you want to just give like a sort of very brief description about it, and maybe just sort of how that's appearing in the workplace?
Yeah, so burnout, official definition, the World Health Organization gave us basically prolonged period of stress that has a detrimental impact on our health and well-being. Typically 3 main elements to it: exhaustion, cynicism, and detaching from work. There is some beef around it as a definition because it's defined as a workplace phenomenon, whereas, arguably single parents might experience burnout. It doesn't necessarily have to be work-related. But it gives us a starting point, which is always good. Burnout. It's one of those things we seem to have seen increase, particularly post-pandemic, and it's no surprise, really, was it? That was a work trauma that we all went through. It was a life trauma we all went through, the pandemic. So It's no great surprise that prolonged stress is having an impact now. I think the shift that I want to see in it is, I think, first around an understanding of it, the difference between stress and burnout. We're all stressed. Some stress is good. We don't want to remove all stress from the workplace. That's actually called rust out. If you're in a job that you're kind of coasting in and you start to get bored, equal symptoms will come, and that's called rust out rather than burnout.
Interesting. Okay.
So we do want a bit of stress. And I think as well, it's one of those where it gets thrown around again probably quite a lot. Oh, I was really burnt out. And it's like, well, yeah, because I've been burnt out and I couldn't get myself off the floor. It's a very serious thing, and there's levels and layers to it. What's interesting and quite really sad making is the level of burnout we're starting to see in Gen Z and joining the workforce. Right. They're joining the workforce exhausted. They're joining the workforce cynical. They're joining the workforce detached from any kind of meaning in work. Because they've had a hell of a few years finishing university during the pandemic, joining the workforce during the pandemic. That was a very different working reality. Very, lots of ambiguity, lots of uncertainty. Nobody knew how to handle it. And at that point in your early career, you want to have someone to look at and go, is this right? Is everything okay? And the people above are going, I don't know, mate. I have no idea. So it's frightening to see this level of burnout in our young people joining the workforce, and with that, even more responsibility for us as business owners, leaders, to protect well-being, but to create the environments, that are going to nurture positive mental health. It's not about the mindfulness at lunch. It's not about the ping pong table. It's not even about the great benefits. It's, excuse me, it's having great managers. It's having positive relationships with your colleagues. It's about having autonomy in your work. It's about having some say over changes that are made. It's about getting good recognition. It's about having reason in your work. It's about understanding what your organization is trying to do, being aligned with it, and understanding your role in that mission delivery. That's how we build resilience. That's how we build well-being. And that's the organizational side of it that is so important. As we were talking before, that's the lake. That's the lake that we're cultivating and doing all of those things. So there you go. That's burnout, which I think is, again, what's good is it's giving us vocabulary to talk about things,
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting what you were saying at the end, because that's a lot of things that we definitely resonate here in terms of making sure people can be as autonomous as they can and letting people have discussions about, if something's not right, or a job's not right, seeing if we can move you somewhere else in the organization. And I think that probably helps people remove one aspect of burnout, because obviously a lot of people are Gen Z and they've moved here and they've started their job. And I remember what was quite interesting I had a friend who I think was getting, maybe not burnout, but was getting very exhausted because they joined their job from home. So they joined an organization where traditionally everybody had worked together, so they all knew each other, but they had to join as a remote employee because of the pandemic, and that wasn't set up properly. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on kind of working from home and sort of being in the office, and whether burnout or anything like that kind of can play into that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things there that kind of spark a thought, and it's such a hard situation, isn't it? And it must have been hard for anybody, whatever age, joining an organization and going through that type of experience. What we understand about the psychology of relationships in the workplace and in life in general is it's one of the most important things in terms of our mental health, in terms of our physical health, even in terms of how long we live. So there's been a long-term study of happiness from Harvard, and I think it's 70, 80 years now it's been running, a longitudinal study.
Oh, wow.
And undeniably, the biggest and best predictor of how long and well you will live is the quality of relationships you have in your life. Wow. So if you don't have those relationships in your work, then you're not going to benefit from that. We call it psychological capital. It builds hope and optimism, self-efficacy or confidence. So positive relationships build all those positive attitudes we have about ourselves and attitudes about the world. And that's what helps to build our resilience. So relationships are really important for that. So I think anybody who joined an organization in the pandemic and didn't have the opportunity to integrate and build those relationships, understandably is going to have a significant impact on your mental health, and unsurprisingly will lead to symptoms of burnout. I think in terms of the argument of can we build those relationships virtually or in person is a different conversation. Yeah. I myself have been working remotely, virtually in some capacity for more than 10 years. I've worked off site. I've managed teams remotely. I've managed a remote team. And now as, being self-employed, I have great friendships and relationships with people I've still never met in real life. Yet they're the people that I'll chat to about different things, work problems, something that's bugging me. It's called virtual intimacy. And actually the research has shown that younger millennials and Gen Z are really, really good at building virtual intimacy, digital intimacy. Yeah. In terms of the face-to-face, of course, we still need a bit of face-to-face from time to time. That doesn't necessarily have to come from our work. It comes from other aspects of our life as well. It comes down to, I think, the whole remote office thing. Will they, won't they? Who's going to win? It doesn't really matter. It's context. If you're going to build a great culture, you can do that online. If you can do it in person. And what the research is showing is now, post-pandemic research, is that remote working isn't a driver of employee engagement, performance, or well-being. It's a moderator. So what that means is that if you've got a great culture and you take that culture remote, it's going to be a great culture where people are still engaged. In fact, it's going to get even better because people have got a bit more autonomy, a bit more integration of their work and life. If you've got a bad culture with bad relationships and you take that remote, then it's going to get worse and people are going to drift apart and disengage from their work. So it's remote isn't the driver people think it is. It's the moderator or the magnifier. And I think the frustration of some of the companies who are now, the harsh return to work mandates and you have to swipe in and all that various surveillance that organizations seem to be bringing in is because they didn't have a great culture to begin with, and they've seen that erode through remote work. Now they're desperately trying to pull people back in. Managers are losing that sense of control, power, let's be honest. And that's where it's becoming part of the RTO man. It's becoming part of working life. And, organizations will decide what works best for them. People will decide what works best for them. But yeah, in terms of is remote or in person better, it's a null question. It's just context. The only other thing I'd say about working remotely, which can be really tricky, particularly if you're 100% remote, is the work-life integration. Those boundaries get really, really blurry, don't they?
Yeah.
And I think that works for some people really well. For others, it's much more difficult. And really, it's an individual that needs to kind of figure out those boundaries. We see countries like France that will go, right, no emails after 6 o'clock. In theory, that sounds kind of good.
Love
but
that.
If I want to pick up my kids from school and spend, 4 till 6 with them and then jump online for an hour to just bash off some emails, then, that doesn't work as well for me, not be able to send an email after 6 o'clock. So it's all very individual. But yeah, I think the boundary setting is really important. And again, something that I talk to a lot about my clients who take it really seriously, the young people they have, especially working from home, is how do we encourage people to set these boundaries that work for them and are individualized, but how do we encourage them? How do we enforce them? And that can be as simple as making sure people take their holiday leave. It's amazing how many organizations have 25 days holiday, but the average person will take 18. And it's like, well, they're literally losing a week of holiday, Things like, if you're a manager, don't come into work when you're ill, when you're sick.
Yeah.
Don't log on. Oh, I'm not very well, I'm full of cold, but I'll log on from home. No, you won't. You'll take a sick day because you need to show that that's a boundary. If you're not well enough to work, you're not well enough to log on. So I think it's just things like that. And often these things can be actually quite process driven. So yeah. Lots of thoughts from remote work.
No, that's really interesting because we have a very strong working in office policy, especially when people join, to make sure that it's partly the training aspect, it's much easier in person, and then to make sure that everybody has like a name to a face. But we did have a discussion, and after a while, the policies kind of changed once you're a bit more established. But we did have a discussion about it at work because they, the people who sort of make these decisions wanted to hear what people thought and what they wanted and what might be reasonable. And somebody said, well, if you don't want to come into the office, all the time, we might want to examine why, why aren't you tempting us into the office? And obviously, there are personal reasons or whatever. But it was a really interesting question. It's like, why are people not coming in potentially? So I really like that.
I love that. And what a brilliant leader to go, interesting. And again, it's usually the entrepreneurial leaders that go, interesting, I want to know more about that. That curiosity kicks in. They're like, I want to know why. Because either there's something I don't understand about you and your life that I could be supporting you better with, or there's something I'm not understanding about the environment that we're fostering in the office. Either way, that needs some investigation. I love that.
Yeah, no, we're very, not to harp on about us, but we're very, very like that. It's sort of privately owned and very still entrepreneurial, even though we're sort of growing. So, yeah. I was going to ask just a couple of quick questions to kind of round it off. So the first one is, what is the kind of worst perk you think you've seen to try and tempt people into the office or try and create a culture, in terms of like the ping pong table or something like that?
Oh, that's a great question. What's the worst perk? Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think I'm going to have to go with kind of the fun at work thing, whatever that looks like, whether it be a ping pong table or a cinema room or pizza Fridays or, that type of thing. And I think what frustrates me about it is I understand what you're trying to do, but what we've done is we've disconnected the what and the why. The reason that Google, these big tech companies with big complexes, started making these more casual breakout areas, ping pong tables, cinema rooms, was because they're trying to build these relationships that we talked about that are so important. And it's that sentiment, but also allowing people the time to do that. So go and have a meeting in that breakout room. Yeah, take half an hour, break and just buy a chat through a pub and play some ping pong table. But there's not many organizations that are going to go, where's Bill? Isn't he meant to be working on that big project? Oh yeah, he's just having a game of ping pong table to clear his mind and think through a problem. There's very few business owners who are going to understand that actually that type of repetitive activity is going to stimulate the prefrontal cortex and stop that, that problem solving. They're just going to go, no, that's meant for like after work or something. You know what I mean? So I think it's the what and the why.
That's so funny.
And if you've got a high workload, then you're not going to go and watch something on, I don't know. It's the what and the why that bugs me. So I think anything around that, and particularly because it's in office as well, it's like I'd be much more interested in you investing the money to pay for people's cost to commute into the office than putting in a ping pong table. So yeah, and I think also what could probably be summarized with any of the worst perk is perks that are decided by the senior leadership team and board in a room with no employee consultation. The ones that really get me as well are the really like costly benefits. Like when people talk about giving equity to employees, and it's like, yeah, intuitively you think that would be really a great thing to do. But there's, organizations that I've kind of been adjacent to have gone through this consultation process. And when they've gone, with this idea, people have gone, we're not interested in equity share. What we actually want is this. We want better healthcare. And it's like, okay. So I think any perk that if you're as a leader deciding the perk, you're doing it wrong. Go and talk to people, see what they want.
Absolutely. And that seems, slightly insane to bring in a table or something and then penalize somebody for actually using it. That's bizarre. Did I have one more question? Yes. What advice do you have for, I'm going to say, an employee if they are in a work environment that they're not happy with? Apart from moving, what advice would you give them?
I think the thing to remember if you're in a job you really don't like is there's other stuff out there, but the most important and valuable thing you can do for yourself is do some reflection and introspection, because finding a new job is kind of the last stage of that process, that transition. It's as we've said before, if you take some time to understand what's important to you, what your values are, how you want to spend your day, how you want to be invested in, how you want to learn, whether remote work is important to you, what types of benefits or perks, what your plans are in terms of family. There's all these various things that contribute to our identity. There's actually an awesome exercise called Vitals by a psychologist called Dr. Audrey Tang. It's in her book, The Leader's Guide to Resilience, but it's a brilliant exercise for anybody at any level. Vitals. And it looks at your values, your interests, your temperament, your around the clock, so what time of day you function best at, your life goals and your strengths. With the idea that if you have a really good idea of what your vitals are, and we know from the science that these vitals help form our identity, but also help us experience fulfillment in our lives, then if we know what these are, we can keep an eye on when they're being compromised, how many of them are being compromised, what alternative there might be that might meet one of our vitals better, or in fact, where our vitals are being met by something outside of work. It could be at times that, my values aren't 100% aligned to my job, but it's a great development opportunity and it's a 2-year plan and then I'll be out of here. So I'm going to go and volunteer at the local mental health charity shop just to make myself feel a bit better about things. Or it might be, that your life goals is to start your own business. So I'm going to hop around as many little small businesses, tech companies as I can over the next 5 years to absorb all of the ideas and innovation, whatever it is. But it's having that mindfulness in terms of what's important to you and what fuels your energy, what takes your energy and what fuels it. So I think if you're really not liking your job, you'll gain so much value from just doing some reflection on why you don't like your job. What is it about that job? Is it the people? Is it the boss? Is it the work? Is it the company? Is it the values? Is it, what is it? It could end up actually that once you do that level of reflection, your job's all right. It's just there's other aspects of your life that aren't quite in sync and aren't meeting your vitals. So I think that's the key. If you can afford to engage a coach, I would always recommend that to help facilitate these types of conversations and exercises. But I appreciate early on in your career, you might not have that money knocking around, but there's loads of great free resources out there. Great self-coaching books. That would be my advice, really. And I think one thing I'd say, and I saw this on socials recently, was a conversation. It was American, so it was quite dramatic. But a conversation with a senior business leader in corporate and a Gen Z, unidentified Gen Z, didn't name him, just a Gen Z, saying, and the older leader was saying, but you need to pay your dues. You need to pay your dues. That's just how it works. Bollocks. No, you don't. You really don't. Not if it's a detriment to your mental health and physical health. Not if it's eroding your own sense of identity and who you are. No, it's not. Of course, we all have to get up, and majority of us have to get up and work and make some money to have the life that we want to lead, whatever that looks like. But you can only do it for so long at a detriment to your own mental health, because that leads to burnout. And as I said, when severe burnout, if you read about cases of severe burnout, it's devastating. It's detrimental. It takes years to recover. To recover. So it's not something to be taken lightly.
Yeah.
And it's not something to just accept that that's just the way work is. No, because that's why organisations have been getting away with treating people the way they have for the last 50 years. Because we've all convinced that that's the way it is. And hopefully social media will help us share our experiences, share our stories, the positive ones as well. Like, you guys at Halo. So you go, do you know what? Work doesn't have to be like that. Look at those guys over there. They're having a great time with an awesome manager. I want that and demand that.
I love that. And I like, especially, I think sometimes people, when they're thinking about what they're getting from work and what they have in their life and trying to balance things, I think sometimes they just think about values or purpose and finances. And actually, as you just pointed out, there are a lot more things to it than just those two aspects. And that's really interesting as well. I really like that.
Yeah, definitely. It's cliche, isn't it? But the more you understand yourself, the more you're going to stand what works for you. So yeah, indulge in some reflection and some understanding yourself, and with that, the flaws and the weaknesses and the things that we need to work on. For example, I can go off on a rant sometimes. So, I have a podcast that is edited, luckily. Otherwise, I probably would have gone to, had some complaints. But yeah, you find your way in the world, I think. There's a lot of pressure on young people. I found my 20s really hard. Really, really hard. I don't think you could pay me enough money to go back to being in my 20s. Really, really hard. So I think our young people, also need that compassion, empathy from people who are a bit further on, as I need that compassion, empathy from people who are ahead of me in their life and careers. Generations are talked about in a way that can feel like it's segregating, that it's us and them. But really, the research for generations was done so we could empathize more and understand each other more, understand each behaviors and what drives us and what our preferences are. We are different. Of course we are. We grew up in very different times with very different experiences. That impacts our human psychology. Of course it does. But just because we're different doesn't mean we can't all, find ways to work together and create something awesome.
Yeah, that's so true. And I guess that's one of the beautiful things about podcasts, is it helps share all of those experiences, and so everyone can hear from the different generations together. So that's really nice.
Yeah, we did an episode actually with a generational panel. We had a boomer, an X, a millennial, and a Gen Z talking about various different aspects of work and working life, and it was really interesting, the overlaps in consensus and some of the disagreements as well. But it was a really interesting conversation, and one that actually ended with a lot more understanding and awareness, I think, of each other. And I think that's all we can hope for as content creators, is trying to bring conversations to people that maybe make them think about things differently or see things in a different way, or, open, consider an opinion or a person they've written off as maybe something worth, exploring a bit more. That's all we can hope for, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for spending the time and talking to me today. It was all really interesting, and it was really interesting to hear a bit of the history behind kind of workplace culture and what's been going on for the past few years and decades. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. I love that I'm now old enough to contribute to history.
I
Don't know how that happened.
Well, also from telling us about the 1920s, which I'm sure you weren't alive for.
I understand my teasing. Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a lovely conversation, and yeah, I'm hugely inspired by your organisation and what seems to be happening there. So yeah, it's bravo, and man, if everyone was like that, I'd be out of a job for one. So maybe we need a bit of
that's
chaos
true.
in the world.
Thanks for watching this episode of the Halo Aid podcast. If you like what you see, you can follow for more. And if you're interested in being a guest, you can email us at podcast@imaginatehalo.com.